and that's still under development. But the idea is to kind of control everything to the 2020 count, but take the characteristics from the demographic analysis and the previous estimates to come up with the best possible base. And I want to applaud the population division for this, because they are just they're doing what they can to come up with the best possible estimates, and that's all we really want. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that. And then finally, a big question that I have is, once the Census Bureau over the, throughout the decade, as they establish this population base, will there be an opportunity to challenge that estimates base in light of what we learned from CQR, from the group quarter survey, and whatever else we may learn over the years about any potential error in the census? So I'm going to leave it there. If there's any pressing questions, I'm happy to take it. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Jacqueline.
Bianca would actually like if you could post the link for the crosswalk for the census products in chat.
I will do that.
Yeah. And let's give us a moment here as we swap over to Jacqueline. And Jacqueline, if you'll give us a few seconds, it looks like the recording for this session paused and it's being saved. And so we got a little bit of time though, because we can go all the way up to about 3.
Well, I don't know that I will be able to do that, but I will do my best. Nonetheless, let me.
We'll give a minute, Robert.
It takes me a minute to get the slideshow up anyway, so let me get it up so that we're ready, and then we can start. You can let me know when.
Okay. There's a couple questions here for Robert. So.
All right.
So we have from Justin, as the demand for data at the census block level grows, in particular, sub-state ACS 1-year character estimates, does there see an estimated timeline to that level being publicly released?
Well, I think, I don't know if this is a direct answer to your question, but what's been very clear from the disclosure avoidance that's been implemented is that block level data should really only be used to aggregate into custom geographies. So there's so much noise inserted at the level of one individual block that you really can't take that at face value. If the reported count in a block was 10, the disclosure avoidance is designed such that the actual population could be anywhere from 0 to infinity, really. But that error is supposed to cancel out as you aggregate more and more blocks up to that 500-person threshold. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the best I can do right now.
And then from Larry Brotman, Robert, what is your assessment of the impact of the local update of census addresses? Luca, thanks.
Yeah, good question, Larry. That's something I'm trying to get a better understanding of myself. So Luca was a huge success at the state level. It was well funded. We added tens of thousands of addresses to the Census Bureau's master address file, and that was just the state campaign. We had counties, cities, and tribes doing their own Luca program, and the response nationwide was overwhelming. In a good way, but also in a bad way, because the Census Bureau wasn't prepared to process all of those submissions. So, they got millions of addresses that had to be incorporated into their master address file, had to be validated for accuracy, had to be deduplicated from their existing records. And as some of you may know, particularly in remote rural areas and tribal areas, you can have many aliases for the same address. And the Bureau simply didn't have the resources to process all of those submissions. This is very well documented in a report from the Government Accountability Office. And so what happened was a lot of those housing records were not deduplicated or validated prior to the actual enumeration. And so a lot of the burden fell on the enumerators out in the field. And so I heard a lot of anecdotes about individuals in rural New Mexico who received multiple census invitations. That is, once the update leave operation resumed after a long pause due to COVID, there were many households who received multiple invitations with different unique IDs. It's not like they were receiving them, just a duplicate of the same invitation. And that may have been a result of the inability to deduplicate those prior to enumeration. So I think what I'm trying to say is that Luca may have been too successful and the Bureau wasn't quite prepared. And I can share, Larry, the GAO report that summarizes that quite well. Nonetheless, I think it's an important lesson, and we must improve the residential address database here in New Mexico over in the years to come, and not wait until 2028, 2029. And the same thing with the Bureau. There's clearly an opportunity for the Census Bureau and the state of New Mexico. There's a clear need and desire for an improved address database, and we have to carry that momentum. We can't wait till 2028. There's so many benefits of having an accurate and up-to-date address list beyond just the census, public safety being the most important among them. You have houses in New Mexico where first responders can't find that house, or they can't find the access point to that house. And so I know that the Census Bureau has plans through their Frames program and to improve their address list, and I hope that we can do the same here in New Mexico. So thank you. I want to let Jacqueline go now, because I know I'm going well over time, and I know Jacqueline has a lot to share with us today.
Thank you, Robert.
All right. So you see my slides properly?
Yes, we do.
Okay,
Good.
and apparently I also did remember to unmute myself, so that's great.
And I see that we're recording again, so we're good.
All right. So I think I was already mostly introduced, but I'm Jacqueline Miller, and I am working at the Geospatial Population Studies with Robert. And I'm going to talk about the population estimates and projections for New Mexico specifically. And then these are population estimates that we produce at GPS as opposed to the census's population estimates. I will get back to this as we go later, but the projections that I will present on today will be the same as last year. So if you remember what happened last year, then it'll all be a review. I did see a question about when the projections will be updated. I will touch on that as well down the road today. All right, so population, I'm going to give some background on population estimates and projections, the methodology we use, and then share the actual numbers and some of the trends that we're seeing in New Mexico and what we expect for the future. Apparently, I did not update the numbers. It will be the 2020 estimates and not the 2019 estimates that I'll be showing you. The population estimates are observations about current trends or past populations. They differ from projections, which basically predict the future, and trends, which we'll get to see later. Estimates are far less expensive than doing a census. As a state, we can't do a census every year. As we all saw in very recent history, sorry about that, there's a lot that goes into planning a census. So an estimate uses existing data to make inferences about population change. And there are several methods for calculating estimates, with each of them having known biases. I'll talk about our usual approach to estimates, and then I'll also discuss how this year's estimates are a bit different from the usual approach. The census, our state and local agencies, also private sectors and organizations, all produce estimates. They'll often focus on different geographies or specific populations depending on their goals and what they're aiming to understand. So the U.S. Census does produce their own estimates, as I mentioned. So you might ask why New Mexico produces their own. The census is required to use the same methodology across all states. So they can't use data that differ from state to state. So one example of data that the census cannot use is school enrollment data, which is typically a very good and consistent measure of school-aged kids, as long as you are not in a global pandemic, which, even though it's happening now, is thankfully not a super common occurrence. The census also uses, as I mentioned, so they use one methodology so that they can use it consistently across the states and to be able to, produce it really frequently. They revise the estimates every year for the whole decade. But this doesn't allow them to evaluate differences that are produced by different methods. And reviewing the differences in different methods can provide for insights into how New Mexico is growing, as opposed to just how much New Mexico is growing. And I have some examples of that as well down in a few slides. They also do not produce estimates for census tracts, which we do at UNM GPS. And these are really important geographies for public health. So, for example, the Department of Health uses tract level data to be able to provide data at smaller levels and across counties, not just for a county level or just the city level, for example. We also use different race categories than the census does, and this is because of the request of the Department of Health, so that they can make sure that their public health data is consistent over the time, even when the Census Bureau's race categories may change over time. So here I have a list of several different methods. We use multiple methods to use to estimate population changing. And the first is the cohort component method, and this is actually what the census uses as well. And this is, I didn't update the equation that's here, but Robert had showed it earlier. It's essentially saying, okay, well, if we have a base population, how many births have happened? Let's subtract the number of deaths and then add in or subtract migration, depending on if it is if net migration is positive or negative, and then you'll get to a current population. And this is a really good method, especially if you have perfect data. But of course, we do not have perfect data in regards to migration in particular. Birth and death, we have pretty good data. The next method is looking at housing units, and this is basically looking at how many housing units have been added or removed through demolitions, and taking an understanding of how many people generally live in each house or type of housing unit. So fewer people usually live in an apartment than in a single family house, for example. Ratio correlations look at how many, you take a specific data set and look to see how many the ratio of that data set to the census in a given year, and then you take that same ratio to apply it to what the population would be in the current year. And I'll just show you some of the data sets we use for that. And then the cohort change just looks at sort of saying, okay, let's see how these cohorts are going to shift over time. And each, as I mentioned earlier, has their own bias. So because we can use multiple methods, we are able to understand how more nuances in how the population is changing, but we can also minimize the bias from any one method by using multiple methods. And so when we're doing those various methods, we are using several different data sets, including data from the Department of Health on vital records, driver's license data, school enrollment, voter registration. We look at, but it's not as strong as a data source for us because it is something that tends to be a bit cyclical. Medicare data is strong, migration files, and then building permits. So for example, an increase in Medicare enrollment may reflect an aging baby boomer population, but it also could suggest that the seniors are moving into New Mexico if the Medicare enrollment shows more people than we would expect based on the prior year's population. And then school enrollment data, conversely, might show how our young population is changing. And so by being able to use these different data sets, we're able to see how different age groups are changing. So to conduct the estimates, we start with using the aforementioned inputs and to calculate a state total. And then we calculate county totals using the county level data. And we rate that state total to the state total so they're consistent. So all that means is we just make sure that the counties add up to what we said the state total should be. And we make those adjustments proportionally. We then proportionally distribute the county data to the tract levels, and we calculate the characteristics across each geography between tracts, age groups, race, ethnicity, and sex. We have a total of about 300,000 records, so there's a lot of pieces, and they all need to line up accordingly, right? They all have to add up to the appropriate sums. And then these values are all need to be evaluated to make sure that they make sense, right? We did make some changes to this approach this year. As I said, I will mention that in a moment. But first, I want to mention some of the things that influence uncertainty and error in the estimates. First, like any analysis, there's always going to be a degree of uncertainty and error expected in the estimates. Generally speaking, error increases as the populations get smaller. So when you're talking about smaller level tracts, there's going to be more error than at the county level. And there's going to be more error in the county level than there is at the state level. The decennial census is always the starting point for any estimate. So the further you get from a census, the more room there is for error. And there can also be error if you don't have a good census, or if the data from the census is not accurate. We do think that our state totals are pretty good from the 2020 census, thankfully, but if for some reason the details, which haven't even been released yet, if they are not as accurate due to the disclosure avoidance methods, then that will put error into our estimates as well. Error is also higher in specific groups, and this is in part due to the fact that there is a greater undercount for these groups during the census historically. And also when there's a lot of change, there's a lot of error because the past trends are not as good at predicting what's going to happen. So they're no longer making an accurate assessment of change. There we go. Okay, so what's different about the estimates this year before I actually show you the estimates? So because we did have a census, I was able to use the April 2020 census counts for the state and county totals for our base population. Whereas in previous years, I was using the 2010 census, of course. However, we do not have detailed characteristics from the 2020 census. So as Robert mentioned earlier, we do not have information on how the age distribution of the population, and we don't even have sex of our population. So we don't know how many male females there are in the population. So what we did was I took the county level birth and death data from April through June of 2020 to get an estimate for July 1st, 2020 population. I did assume minimal migration, and I know that's probably going to be a little bit of a hot topic of debate. But the reason for this was that there was only 3 months. And, from what I could see, and we don't really have good data on this, is that there was a lot of movement at some point, but I don't know that it all happened in April, May, and June of 2020. Due to the fact there was a lot of houses that were not for sale. People, I think, got stuck where they were in March, but I don't know that there was a lot of moving happening at that time. And it's also questionable whether or not that would have been a permanent change or not. to get the track level estimates, we use GIS techniques to assign 2020 block population data to the 2010 census tracts for April 1st, 2020. There was two reasons for this. One, it allows the Department of Health to have sort of a consistency for their trends to say, okay, here's what changed from 2019 to 2020. It also allows us to take characteristics that we had from the previous decade to inform our characteristics in our current estimates, because we do have those assigned for census tracts, the 2010 census tracts, but we do not have any information on characteristics based on the 2020 census tracts, which are different geographies. And then we proportionally distributed the population change from April 2020 to July 2020 based on the prior decade's pattern of growth for each track, holding the county total invariant. So the track totals had to add up to the county totals. And then the population characteristics were distributed using being informed from the National Center for Health Statistics data, which uses the 2010 census as a base, and that's in part because we don't have any characteristic data from the 2020 census. We don't have sufficient characteristic data. We know how many people are over 18 and under 18, but that's not sufficient. Okay, so so now that we've reviewed what estimates are and some of the caveats, let's look at some of the estimates that we have. Our estimates are, so here I have 3 lines. I have so UNM GPS estimates are in the red line, which as you can see, we actually underestimated the population as well. But the gray line is a Census Bureau estimate. So while our estimate of the population was lower than what the count suggests, it was higher than the Census Bureau's estimates. And we will be working on reviewing our estimates and seeing how to proceed for this coming decade. The total growth from the 2010 census to July 2020 is 2.8%. As you can see, there is actually a drop in the population from April to July, and that reflects more the fact that there was more deaths than births during that period. And I will get through each of the pieces that inform it in a minute. Once the census releases the data on characteristics of a population in 2020, we'll work to revise our estimates to get a better sense of how the population changed over the past decade. And there was one other piece that I wanted to put a plug in here, is that one piece of information that is really helpful for us to understand how the population grows and where it grows specifically is building permit data. But we've had struggles with many municipalities actually sharing them. So if you have any connections to those areas and want to see some improvements in our estimates, let me know. We have the New Mexico, the CID, who collects the permits for the smaller areas in particular, does not like to give us all the building permit data. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And then the last piece I want to show you on this is this dotted line, and that is essentially a smoothed out estimate from 2017 to 2019 to sort of show kind of a smoother line to the current population. And I did this so that it was a little bit more, that the next few slides make a little bit more sense as we go through understanding migration. As it's unreasonable to assume that the difference between our 2019 estimate and 2020 census count was all due to 2019 migration. We don't expect that there was roughly 10,000 people who moved in that year. Instead, I think that it was likely distributed over several years. Okay, So despite the fact that there was growth, it is relatively flat, I'd say. Like 2.8% is not a substantial growth. So why is that? And basically, as we saw in the demographic balancing equation, there are basically three factors that determine population: births, deaths, and migration. So birth rates are down, deaths are up, and migration has generally been out or flat for the most part. Although that it looked like it was starting to change as we came up to the pandemic. So fertility is at historic lows. This is a graph that shows that it doesn't go to current date, but we still are seeing data. Fertility is actually dropping even lower. You see that it does tend to drop when there are major periods of uncertainty or war. So each war, there's a drop. Each recession, there tends to, well, except for this recession, but generally there tends to be drops after recessions, and we've continued to have low fertility since the Great Recession. Let's see. This is fertility specific to New Mexico, the total fertility rate among Hispanic and non-Hispanic women in New Mexico. The magic number in fertility is 2.1. A total fertility rate of 2.1 is the rate needed to replace the current population. This means that each biological woman would have to have an average of 2.1 women or children during their childbearing years. And numbers higher than that would lead to more growth in a population, while numbers lower would result in decline. So as you can see from this graph, the non-Hispanic women are already experiencing levels below, here's 2 right here. So they're already experiencing levels below replacement. And then Hispanic women are getting pretty close. They're not there yet. But their fertility is declining, or had been declining more rapidly. So it is likely that they will also be below replacement in the near future. So the next piece is mortality. So this graph shows the death counts for New Mexicans over the last 20 years. Death rates are up largely because our population is aging. They're up even more in the last year due to the pandemic. So there's a pretty big jump here, and that's largely due to the fact that we had more deaths than one would expect in the pandemic. But the overall increase, the increasing trend is a reflection of one is that people there are some indications that people might be living not as long due to the fact that there's a lot of issues with poverty and limited exercise and access to healthcare. But the biggest influence is actually an increase in mortality due to an aging population. People who are older are more likely to die, and as a result, we have more deaths. As I mentioned, though, this large jump is a reflection of COVID deaths. This graph shows natural increase in New Mexico. It does say to 2020 here, so that we have from 2001 to 2020. The bars show births and deaths. As you can see, in 2020, it was the first year where we actually had more deaths than births. And we were headed in this direction even without COVID, although I did not expect it until 2022. Had we not had a pandemic, I was expecting that we would hit a point where we were having fewer births than deaths in about 2022. But we actually reached that point prematurely due to COVID. So at this point, natural increase is not leading to our population growing. It means that we are at a point where we are completely dependent on migration for our population to grow, unless there are other changes that happen. So as you can see, the deaths here are in fact higher than the births. So on this graph, the gray line shows what our population would be if there was zero migration since 2010. If our population only grew from natural increase, so the number of births and deaths that we observed. The gap between the two lines reflects migration. So the population would actually be higher now than what we are observing if we only looked at the change in population due to births and deaths, which suggests that more people are leaving than moving in. In New Mexico, we actually did seem to have a small amount of in-migration after the 2009 recession. But as other states recovered, New Mexico started to have more out-migration, as is shown by the sort of the gap that appears sort of after 2014, where the natural increase line is higher than the New Mexico population. However, the gap is not widening, which suggests that out-migration may have slowed, or that the in-migration has started to pick up in the last few years. Right. So, of course, migration is not the same across the state, and population change is not the same across the state. So the counties on this chart are listed from biggest to smallest. It's sort of easier to process all this data, I think, in that way. The bigger counties on the left are seeing some growth, which with the largest growth happening in Sandoval, Lee, Eddy, Otero, and Los Alamos. And then, like much of the country, some of the more rural counties are seeing the largest declines. As we have been seeing for many years now, there's sort of being a little bit of a shift in a racial composition. And so you can see there's sort of this. This shows just the change in the racial composition from 2010 to 2020. What I want to point out is I think there's going to be some confusion here. There does appear to be a drop in the percent Hispanic white, but this is largely because it does not capture all the people who are Hispanic. There are people who are Black Hispanic, or Native American and Hispanic, or Asian and Hispanic. Has not been a drop in the Hispanic population, as I will show you on the next slide. So as you can see, there has been an increase in the percent Hispanic, with the percent Hispanic now exceeding the percent non-Hispanic in New Mexico. I don't know exactly what's happening in the data for the 2019. It looks like there was just something weird happening in our models that year that kind of created this sort of jump, and then it went down. But if you look at the lines, the general trend is consistent. We are also seeing a large growth in the 65 and older age category, while we're experiencing a decline in the young and working age people. This is in part due to out-migration of young families, and in-migration of seniors, but it's also due to the aging of baby boomers, who are simply aging into the 65 plus category. So as I mentioned earlier, different data sources help show changes in the data a bit better. I think these graphs show the changing age composition well. So on the left, you see the school enrollment is declining rapidly while Medicare enrollment is climbing. I did not include 2020 data here because we all know that 2020 was a really weird year, and there were people who were removed from schools and not enrolled in schools who would have still lived in New Mexico just because of the remote learning ordeal. However, I would not expect a sudden change in the general age distribution of the population that would be reflected in there. I think that this trend is continuing, though COVID may have had some impact. All right, so I'm going to talk about the population projections. We are over time. If I think Susan is going to post these recordings somewhere. Is that correct, Susan?
I will, and you have time. We're free all the way till 3.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a heads up. This shouldn't take too long. I just wanted to mention it in case somebody had to leave but wanted to hear about the projections. So.
Yeah, we still want to see the projections.
Yeah, I'm going to go through the projections. I just wanted to make sure that the recordings would be available for anyone who couldn't stick around.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so what do we expect for the future of New Mexico? So first off, population projections, they depend on the same components as population estimates. But instead of looking at how many births and deaths have happened in the past year, for example, we have to think about what we expect is going to happen in the future. So as we discussed earlier, fertility is down, deaths are up, and migration has been out for much of the last decade. Are these trends likely to continue? Should we assume they do? I will talk about the assumptions we made in a moment, but first it's also important. The other important factor is the age of your population. So for example, if you have a young population, you're going to have more births than if you have a population who is mostly of retirement age. The retirement population doesn't tend to have a lot of babies, as one would expect. So let's just talk a little bit about changing age structure first. I went ahead and kept these with the old data because, as I mentioned earlier, the projections are based on the 2010 census. So this figure shows a population pyramid, which is just a way of visualizing the age structure of a population. In this particular case, it's obviously of New Mexico. The shaded bars represent the 2010 population, and the dark borders represent the 2018 or 2019 population. And you can see here that we actually have more people of childbearing age now in this range than we did in 2010. But because fertility rates have decreased, we have fewer young children than we did in 2010. So fewer young people means that fewer people are having children, even if the number of children each woman has changed. As these young people age, we will have fewer and fewer people of childbearing age unless people move into the state. Because so much of the population change depends on the age structure of the population, the projections I am presenting today have not been revised using the new census count information. This is because the Census Bureau has not released the detailed age and sex information yet. And so consequently, the projections I'm presenting are going to be the same as last year's. So now I'll go ahead and tell you what my assumptions were. So the fertility, we expect the fertility will continue to decline for Hispanic women, bringing the overall state fertility rate down to the current rate for non-Hispanic women. In many areas of the world, the total fertility rates have actually declined even further than the total fertility rates we are observing in New Mexico. So it is possible that this is an optimistic assumption. I do not think that it is likely that it is a pessimistic assumption. So what that means is basically, I think that if anything, we are overestimating fertility in our models. There's a good chance that fertility will decline even more unless there is some major shift, cultural shift or policy shift, although there doesn't tend to be a lot of success in policies influencing fertility. But there are things that can change people's perspective on life, and who knows what the impact of a pandemic might have on fertility in the long run. In the short run, it looks like it had reduced fertility, but what happens in the years to come, we'll see. In terms of mortality, again, we don't know exactly what will happen. This never really can. Will people start dying at a younger age due to unhealthy habits and poverty and healthcare access, or will we have some miracle drug that will prolong life, extensively? We don't really know, but we do have to make assumptions. And so our assumption is that mortality will remain at the current rates based on age. So your likelihood of dying at 65 now is going to be a similar probability of death at 65 in 10 years, which is, of course, a lower probability of death than, say, somebody who is 90 years old, and higher than somebody who is 30 years old. And then for migration, which is the most easily debated assumption, but none of us can really know what to expect there either. For these projections, what I did was I have migration was low from 2010 to 2020, which is what we observed. But then migration from 2020 to 2040, I gradually increased until it reached sort of the average of the migration patterns that we observed in the 2000s and in the 2010s. So this allows for sort of periods of higher migration and lower migration, despite not knowing when those periods will occur, right? Like we might have periods of high migration and it just, and we just don't know if that'll be in 2030 or if it would be 2035. So with those assumptions, the New Mexico population is expected to peak around 2033. And after that, despite assumptions of increasing migration, we have a declining population as the population ages. So there are fewer young people, and those young people continue to experience fertility rates that are below replacement. This graph shows the rate of growth in New Mexico. Numbers above 0, which is the dashed line, reflect a population that's growing, and numbers below 0 reflect a population that is shrinking. If our assumptions hold true, the population will grow, albeit slowly, until about 2033, and then when we start seeing a decline. The decline likely does not come as a surprise given the decreasing fertility, migration, and increased mortality in our aging population. Okay, so this slide highlights the changing age of our population that I've referenced. As you can see, our population is moving up with a larger population at the top of the pyramid than at the bottom of the pyramid. Although much can and likely will change between now and 2040, if trends continue as they are, then this changing age structure becomes even more pronounced in 20 years, with our population pyramid looking less like a pyramid and a bit more like a mushroom. As you can see, the bottom part is narrow. So as I've said many times, things can change, sometimes quite suddenly. Fertility rates could go up, as I've mentioned, policies to encourage this are not typically effective. So I'm not sure what would have to happen to make those changes. Migration could change, leading to more young people staying or moving into the state, which could also have a double impact of also contributing to more births in the state. We'll see how policies are, what policies are enacted in the future and how those might influence the change in the population. But even if fertility rates are low, if there are more young people in the state, that would increase our natural increase, just due to the fact that there are more young people who can contribute to population growth. Okay, so the question about when to expect revised projections. So as I've mentioned, I just went through the key components of population projections, and one of those is how the age distribution, the population is distributed in terms of age. This is of course necessary, one, because age-specific mortality rates are major factors in what we expect in terms of actual mortality, but also because fertility is only possible in a certain age range. And so if we don't know how many people are in that age range who are biologically female, then we are not able to project how many people, how many children are likely to be born in the future. I think Robert mentioned earlier that there's an expectation that the housing and demographic characteristics might be released next summer. I was on a call last week where somebody from the census mentioned that it might not be until the end of 2022. So right now, we really don't know when it's going to be released. We're getting kind of mixed messages. But once it is released, we'll work on evaluating that data and understand how differential privacy has impacted the results. And then we will create revised projections based on that data. So this may be in the summer of 2023, but it might not be until the fall of 2023. So, come back to the Data User Conference in 2023 and we'll see what we have for you. And that is it. So I think now we can, I don't know if there are questions for me, but also if there's questions to go back to Robert's. Let me figure out how to stop sharing this screen. And
so I'm just
so
going
if there are
to tell
questions for me or Robert, that would be fine.
Yeah, we've got a question here in the chat, and I'll bring it in. But I'll you showed the one slide there with kindergarten K through 8 going down and enrollments for Medicare going up, and I was like, wow, just that just changes what you think about how New Mexico is doing, even when you're thinking about economic development. So the first question we have is from Stacy Sacco. Do you anticipate that the number of college age will increase or decrease, and when then impact the number of students registering at our local universities?
Yeah, so right now we've been seeing there's actually been sort of a decline in enrollment in the universities and colleges, and that's not in our projections or in our estimates. That's just kind of in the news. There is a slightly larger group in our population in the 15 to 19 than we have in our 20 to 24. So in that sense, half of those folks are potentially coming up into a college age. But then we're seeing sort of a smaller age groups in the 10 to 14 year olds. So we really aren't seeing. We don't have a larger cohort coming up behind. The next 2 years, maybe there could be some growth just because it's a slightly larger cohort. But in terms of our 10 to 14 year olds, it's not a larger cohort, so I'm not expecting it necessarily to grow. And then I see that there's also a second part to that question about the brain drain. And I think you asked the same question to the folks yesterday. So, I think that the brain drain, and this, I have to look into some of the specific numbers, but I didn't do it this year, to be honest, because there's just plenty of other things going on. But when I did look at sort of where the age groups, where we were losing people, it wasn't in the immediately after college age. It was sort of working family, like sort of later, mid-career. You were losing people in their mid-career, sort of people who were, 35 to 50 years old. And so when I think of what's happening with brain drain, I'm really thinking of, okay, it's once people get to a certain level, they stop being able to continue to progress here and they leave. And I don't know if that's because of job opportunities and inability to continue to move upward in different careers here, or as somebody with young kids, or if, I wonder how much of it is also people thinking, okay, now that my kids are getting a little older, maybe they might want to move to better school districts. And obviously understanding which of those two it is would be really helpful, because those are very different policy approaches. But I don't have the answer to that. Though that's just sort of my speculation of understanding the population changes. But that's the age group that I tend to see as shifting. Gwendolyn, so we do tend to have projections at age-specific categories, but because there's less reliability in that, we don't always publish them. But if you need them for a specific purpose, you can reach out to us, and we do that. Doing it specifically for over 65, we can do that. I'm happy to share I don't know if I've shared with you what we have already previously. I know I've sent you stuff. I just don't know what I sent you. That can be sent, but the revised ones obviously won't be until that demographic and housing characteristics file is released. Saran, I don't know if that one was for me or if that was for Robert regarding the LUCA. Is that up with the LUCA program that you're referring to, the plus codes?
Yeah, I can take that, Jacqueline. Yeah, we have looked at those plus codes. There's some competing platforms, these 3 words, and then there's a new one whose name is escaping me, who does a better job of integrating verticality and like unit placement within a structure. So imagine a multifamily unit and being able to identify the actual unit, or within a shopping mall, being able to identify one store. I think there's a lot of promise there, and I know Navajo Nation has at some level adopted the use of plus codes, but I don't think it solves all of our problems. I think the biggest challenge here in New Mexico is that one of these coding systems can give you a precise location of a structure, but that's very different than figuring out how to get there, right? So that's just one, if you have a structure on Navajo Nation, you have to be able to get from A to B, and that's not always a straight line, and the plus codes don't really solve that problem. So there is some promise to that technology, but it's a long way off, and it's sort of, it's an implementation challenge. It's so it's great that we have some entity in Navajo Nation looking at implementing this, and they can kind of we can learn from that, and maybe we adopt something in the future nationwide. But I think we're a long way off from something like that being part of an official state or federal database.
So I'm not seeing any more questions there, guys. And it was really good. Both of your presentations were great. Thank you. Just so you know, the next session will be tribal area data access. It's our sort of advanced census data access, which is kind of before our basics, but it's how the schedule worked out. It'll start at 3 o'clock.